Now it's time for our expert panel on this week's Think Tank Central. This week saw the biggest escalation of violence in the Gaza Strip since 2014's Operation Protective Edge. What began as border protests by the Palestinians led to fiery kites from Gaza incinerating Israeli fields, Israeli soldiers killing Palestinians with snipers, and now a barrage of rockets from Gaza, followed by a tough round of airstrikes from Israeli fighter jets. Could this be the beginning of a summer war and a new offensive in Gaza? Well, to break this down and what it all means, I am joined in studio by Dr. Amira Halperin, an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Palestinian politics, as well as Mehul Srivastava, the Financial Times correspondent in Jerusalem. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Now, Mehul, we were just speaking that you had just come back from Gaza last week. You spent some time there. Tell us what you saw on the ground.
And one of the most interesting things about working in Israel is that foreign journalists get to go into Gaza and ask the questions that I think Israeli journalists are all very eager to speak to people in the Gaza Strip about. And I think that the one thing that a lot of the foreign journalists came back with is that what we saw on television here in Israel, you know, the kites, the protests, the shootings, were the public image of an incredibly complex private negotiating dance going on between the Israelis, the Egyptians, the Qataris, and the powers in Gaza. And this mostly excluded the Palestinian Authority about how to ease the conditions of the blockade that the Gaza Strip is under. And the protests managed to bring Gaza to the front page for 6 weeks, and they overshadowed the embassy opening. It showed the political relevance of Hamas and its ingenuity in coming up with a way to return both to the front pages of international newspapers, but also to the consciousness of the Israeli neighbors. That's what we felt we saw when we were there.
Well, I mean, you saw what was happening firsthand. Were the protests nonviolent?
I mean, this is one of those things where people want a yes or no answer, and the answer is that they were overwhelmingly nonviolent, but there were certainly small groups of armed men who were directed by Hamas who were trying to take opportunities to create some distraction, to attack, to maybe perhaps score a kill if they could. But in my experience and the experience of a lot of the people who were there, I would say the vast majority were nonviolent protesters.
All right, let's get back to the protests in just 1 second. Now, Dr. Halperin, overnight last night, we saw a barrage of rockets coming from Gaza. Let's put it simply, who won this round?
I think it's always, like always we saw in the past, there are no winners actually, because there is a mutual influence between Hamas and the Israelis, and in case of war, both sides lose. But if we look at Hamas' point of view in the media, for example, in Hamas media and in Fatah media, we will see that they believe that they win the situation here because they say that basically Israel is the attacker and Lieberman is the one that wants the war. And they blame Israel for the aggression, etc. So they say we are only, like you asked earlier, we are only defend ourselves and our rights. So they say we win the situation. Again, the Israel is the same thing, but I don't see anyone that can win from this situation at all.
Well, I mean, where are these rockets coming from? Are they coming from Hamas or are they coming from Islamic Jihad?
I believe that Hamas is in control in Gaza. There was no escalation like this since 2014, and it's very serious. Hamas is in control. He is the chief leader in Gaza, and he controls also on other groups, on Islamic Jihad and other groups. And if he decides that they will continue with the escalation, it will continue, and therefore they have to do something in order to stop it.
So what exactly have we seen this week then? Is Hamas really still in charge?
Hamas is in charge, but Hamas is trying every time to take a local event and a specific event and to raise the international awareness to its case. We see that in its media, for example, Hamas publishes in 8 languages, talking to the world, talking about the Israeli occupation, about the blame that they blame Israel for trying to occupy, and they say that we have been trying for 8 weeks to demonstrate and to say that we need help, there is poverty in Gaza, etc. But Israel doesn't listen. But the opposite is the right thing is the opposite, because they didn't really help the people in Gaza.
Mehul, would you agree from the ground? Did you see any sort of a power struggle there?
No, the professor is absolutely right, because you have to remember that Hamas's only adversary is not Israel. It's also fighting for influence amongst the Palestinian leadership, amongst Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the Arab world. and to show its relevance and to show that it remains the only party in the Gaza Strip that you have to work with to come across some kind of reconciliation, improvement in living standards, easing of the embargo, this shows exactly how deeply in control they are. So the question of whether or not Islamic Jihad or Hamas launched these missiles is perhaps irrelevant, because we all agree that there's nothing happening in that tiny strip of land without Hamas's at least tacit approval. And remember, during the 6 weeks of the protests, there were a lot of protesters demanding rockets, and Hamas said no. This is a slightly disassociated event, but also taking place within the same timeline that we're concerned with.
Well, I also would like to add that at the same time that all the events happen now, the escalation, I attended this week a big conference, International Ministers of Science conference that occurred this week. And, you know, they came delegations of 20 ministers from around the world. It was promoted by the Minister of Science here in Israel. And it was very interesting when I attended this conference to speak with ministers from around the world. At the same time that there is escalation in Gaza border and the problems with Israel and Gaza, and to see that we still have international support. For me, as an Israeli scholar, although I did my research in the British Academia, but as an Israeli scholar, it was very, very important for me to be there, to speak with people from the international community, and to understand that people understand that terrorism is terrorism and Israel is under threat, and especially with the UK, because I did my research in the UK, and I know that the UK is suffering the problem of boycott against Israel, one of the main countries that the problem is there, and I was very happy to see that the Minister of Science of the UK was very sympathetic to this situation here in Israel.
Mehul, would you say that the situation on the ground in Gaza might look similar to what it looked right before the 2014 summer conflict between Gaza and Israel?
I think the difference now between then is that it's very clear that neither the Israelis nor Hamas want a full-out war. This is something that Israeli experts often talk about. This is a way of communicating with your belligerent neighbors, whether it's Hamas, whether it's the Iranians in Syria, through airstrikes and through military techniques to kind of draw new lines. And the lines that are drawn right now are that neither Israel nor Hamas wants to have a full-out war, but everybody's pushing up against these boundaries of the lines that the opponents push up. Do we think that the situation is the same as 2014? We can't truly say, but it is really volatile. Like, this is a very delicate dance that both teams are involved in. If Israeli civilians had been killed yesterday overnight, that would have been a horrible event, but also perhaps precipitated a greater conflict. So it's not clear that everybody's in exact control of the situation.
Do either of you believe that we're going to be seeing more rockets, more protests? How is it going to continue from here?
I believe that, as we see in recent years, rockets will continue. The question is whether it's going to be escalation or a third intifada escalation like 2014 or third intifada is a big question. I think that the major issue within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is also the reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, and not only the relationships of Hamas with Israel.
All right, Dr. Amira Halperin and Mehul Srivastava.